Can institutions be violent and harm people? Why is it so important to understand institutional violence so that we can really have security and peace for our communities? As I speak, it has been almost a month since the killing of George Floyd, an African American killed by the police in the United States, and this has sparked widespread protests, so we have been talking more about institutional violence. But we need to think about it not as something exceptional, not something that has just started happening now, but something that happened all along. And quite often, it's invisible and it can also be silenced. Also, if we want to understand how that kind of violence happened, let's look not just at police killing, but at a wider spectrum of situations that happen when someone from an institution interacts with someone, a member of the public, so that we can understand the nature of that kind of relationship. When you think about violence, probably the first thing that comes to your mind is violence committed by private people, individuals, or criminal groups, or maybe those you might call terrorists. And we know that institutions and states can also be violent as well, right? But we tend to think about those kind of violences as different. They're studied in different fields, they're dealt with in completely different ways and with different approaches. Well, that's not really that surprising if we think that it's institutions themselves that study what violence is, that define what it is, what violence is, what is bad violence, and what violence is okay. And the idea is that the violence that is private and criminal, it needs to be contained by institutions. So it's an idea of security that defines what kind of violence is negative and what kind of violence is okay and is accepted and necessary to keep people safe. Now, also, if we break down incidents of violence to understand how they happen, you might find out that there are a lot of similarities between situations that involve someone who acts as a representative of an institution, who is maybe doing something they are trained for, that is legal and allowed, and maybe with good intention. And incidents that happen elsewhere without institutional representatives, incidents that we call violent. What could be the similarities? Well, it's still an interaction between human beings, people that have emotions that respond to group dynamics. Emotions are always really important in this kind of situations. It's also really important how we interpret other people's intentions, how we interpret people as being dangerous or threatening for ourselves or for others. Also, incidents of violence or that involve use of force, something that they all have in common is that they always establish a power dynamic. A power dynamic in which, one side is trying to dominate the other, and by doing so, it seeks to demonstrate that the other is in some way inferior. It removes or limits their agency. It puts them down, and that can happen through physical ways and use of force, but also very frequently just through psychological dynamics. So far I've been saying that there are similarities and continuities. At the same time, the fact that one side represents an institution is also really important and makes a lot of difference. First of all, because it makes a difference in that power dynamic, right? It makes a difference in the perception of power and the way we behave in that situation. So if you've seen the video of the killing of George Floyd, you might have wondered, how was that possible that someone was killed like that in broad daylight and nobody was able to stop it? So it's not just that people might have been scared of sanctions on themselves, but we also need to understand how those group interactions really shaped by the way we learn to respond to authority and to recognize authority in certain institutions. Now, like I mentioned, we're not just looking at, and actually even microaggressions, when they happen in an institutional environment, they can have a huge impact on people's lives. Why? Because imagine that for example, you go to a healthcare facility and you have concerns about your health, but the other person, even if is well intentioned, maybe because of bias or because of the preconceived ideas they have about you, they dismiss your concerns, and you may end up not having access to really important treatment for you or for your family. Think about social services. So the fact that situations happen in institutions can have really important repercussions, and people may not have access to primary needs or services. So the impact that institution can have on people's life can be really, really broad. It can influence their ability to have access career opportunities, to education, to justice even. So imagine what that means for our community. And we do live still in a society where we rely a lot on coercion, which doesn't necessarily mean violence or restraint, but also on decisions that limit people's ability to decide for themselves, to do things their own way, not just by law enforcement, but also by schools, healthcare facilities, and social services, all kind of situations. It happens every time we think that certain people or certain behaviors are perceived as threatening, as problematic. So we know from research that people from certain backgrounds, from certain social groups, are so much more likely to experience all of these forms of violence, on harm and microaggressions in institutional environments. Even in our latest research on microaggression, we have found that there was very sharp difference with the fact that people of color, people from indigenous communities, people with disabilities or neurodiversity were the ones who experienced microaggressions in institutional environments with a lot of repercussions in their lives. So there are, a lot of statistics showing how people of color, indigenous people, or people with disabilities are much more likely to be, for example, imprisoned, to be killed, to not have the same access to justice, to have children taken from them. Also, young people are more likely to, be in prison quite early, maybe straight from school or before even finishing school. There is the use of restraint and seclusion, even on children. So we have all of these numbers, and quite often the reaction is to think that, well, if people from this group, they're in prison more, maybe that means that they're more violent, and that justifies more coercion on them and more bias. So, it's a cycle that keeps going on and on. But if we look from, the perspective of people's experience, we might want to try to understand what is it like for them to go through all this. How do they feel secure? How is it like for people who work in institutions and do this? They're, with their own emotions, with their own experiences, with their own vulnerabilities. So, and what is it like for us as a community to have this divide, to have that grief and the suffering, between us? How does that make us collectively more safe? So, maybe it's time to look beyond categories and look at people's human experiences so that we can really, have peace and security for everyone.